Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Cyrano, or Cyrano, from 2021. If it's not already obvious, this is an interpretation of the classic play Cyrano de Bergerac. And where do we even get started with this? This is actually an adaptation of an off-Broadway play that was written and produced with many of the same actors, including Peter Dinklage in the leading role, and a number of the other major characters as on stage and then now on film. And in a lot of ways, this does feel like a stage adaptation. Not necessarily in a negative way, but not necessarily in a positive one either. We'll come back to that. Now, about Cyrano de Bergerac, I am not well versed in this particular play, in this particular story. I have never seen an original staging of the play as written, and I have never read the text of it. But I have seen other interpretations of it before in various forms, and being rather old and a kind of a classic story in terms of its overall structure, it lends itself to a lot of different genre interpretations and tone interpretations. However, even the closest interpretations I've seen to the original play seem to be rather different from this one. I actually didn't know going into it that it is a musical. It is not sung through, but there are a substantial number of musical numbers in it. And I think that was sort of the key twist that they wanted to do with this. Now, I don't know in the original staging if there are many, if any, songs. It is not unusual on stage plays, regardless of their general musicality, to have a musical number somewhere in them. And so I can't really speak to that. However, the tone is what is of most interest to me for interpretation. This film interpretation is very much on the side of the drama and the melodrama of the story. And this, in addition to being a musical, surprised me because in my mind, while it is not a happy story, it, to my memory and to my mind, Cyrano de Bergerac is always a bit of a mix of comedy and tragedy. It is in a lot of ways a very classical tragedy, or even Shakespearean tragedy, but more classical in this sense, in the sense of it is able to mix a variety of different tones such that it can be, the through line can be comedic, but the story is ultimately tragic. And I think it's up for, I think it's entirely subjective which one you prefer. I know there are some people who are just kind of bothered by the mix of tragedy and comedy. I, on the other hand, think it is one of the in a really extremely general sense, I think it's a very high form of any art form to be able to mix a variety of tones. And one of the reasons I've always enjoyed a great many of Shakespeare's works is because the works of Shakespeare are largely all somewhere in that spectrum of being pretty comedic, even when they're ultimately tragic. Romeo and Juliet, for example, is hilarious. But I digress. So I wasn't expecting this movie to fall so hard on the side of the drama. Am I entirely surprised given the cultural and media landscape that we're in right now? Not particularly. I think, especially for an off-Broadway, semi-prestige production, I could see why that might not be what people are looking for, and might not be what the screenplay writer wanted to produce. What's interesting about the musical aspect is that it's I'm 50-50 on it. There are some there are some musical pieces. I'd say it's probably split about in half. There are some songs that I think are pretty mediocre. Like I don't want to laud Broadway and say, like, if you don't make it to Broadway, you don't deserve recognition or anything. Quite the contrary, actually. But there are definitely some songs that are like, yeah, I think this one needed a couple more passes before it was ready for full production. Some of that is in the music itself, some of it is in the lyrics, and ultimately some of it is in the performances. I think it's always potentially problematic when moving a musical, even heavily reinterpreting it. I think moving a musical from stage to screen is a tricky process. And if there are issues with the music, there's some minor issues with the music, and there's some minor issues with the lyrics, and if not all of the performances are 100% top notch, and if you then have to frame it within all of the other things that are new about doing cinema instead of theater, I think there are a lot of struggles. On the other hand, the other half of the music is astounding and works incredibly well to emphasize and project the drama of various situations. However, even though I'm impressed by those things, ultimately I wonder a little bit about the overall production. Because, don't get me wrong, it got me. The movie made me cry a couple of times. It worked. It is effective. It is brought together in a way that is genuinely impactful. But even during some of those moments when I was really feeling it, I felt there was a little twinge in the back of my mind of like, yeah, but I'm still bothered by how these characters were characterized in the last scene. I don't feel like they fleshed out this dynamic. I didn't particularly like the pacing of how we got to here, those sorts of things. And while the drama worked, it absolutely worked. I think as a holistic, from a holistic approach, I think it starts to fall apart. There's also a lot of other reinterpretation that's going on. For one, the cast, well, okay. Number one with a bullet, Peter Dinklage. Now, don't get me wrong, I quite like Peter Dinklage. I think when he's cast right, he's excellent, and I would even go so far as to say in this film, he is excellent. However, Cyrano de Bergerac is the plot of Cyrano de Bergerac is ugly, and he has a big nose, and he's not confident in himself as a result, even though he has a great many other positive qualities. And the whole story hinges on that. They chose to, for this interpretation, instead of making him ugly, they make him, and I'm going to use the word because they use it themselves, a midget. They make him a person with dwarfism or of short stature or something like that. And yet they still use a lot of the same language, not about him being ugly, but basically being unapproachable by virtue of his appearance. And I don't think that works because Peter Dinklage, one, is a handsome man. And there is no aspect of his appearance other than really his height or a particular nasty cultural assumption about how he appears that is in any way, for want of a better phrase, a problem to reasonably minded people. Even for the characters in the movie, it's a little troubling for them to act like he is like his dwarfism is a problem. It just doesn't seem to particularly work. He doesn't seem to be deficient in any way other than being short. And anytime the movie points out that he's short in an implicit way rather than an explicit one, his shortness is a benefit, not a problem. And the reason I think this is for a larger reason why this is a problem is Cyrano de Bergerac, and if you have a different interpretation or you've read the book, please correct me or give me your opinion. But Cyrano de Bergerac is a tragic character because it's almost comedic that his relatively limited, he's not horribly disfigured, right? He's got a big nose. He's not very visually attractive, but that's sort of it. And he doesn't believe in himself, or he's confident in a certain kind of way, but does not have a self-confidence that he can project into the world, or he feels like he can project into our world. In a lot of ways, he's very self-sabotaging. And I think that is very, very key to the character. So, for one, that doesn't really work for a person with dwarfism, unless you start to recontextualize other things. If you say, "Oh, I am a terrible sword fighter because I'm short," or whatever. There has to be something to suggest a diminishment of ability or diminishment of self-confidence as a result to get the same sort of tone out of dwarfism instead of facial ugliness. And I also think it is so serious by comparison that whereas the traditional Cyrano de Bergerac is kind of comic in its just his appearance is intentionally somewhat comic, and the way that he talks about himself is somewhat comic, and his supposed pitfalls are somewhat comic. That doesn't really work in this film, both in this film in general and specifically with Peter Dinklage as someone with dwarfism, because he never seems to believe. I don't believe that he actually would undermine himself this badly, other than the moments where he seems to suggest that he, in direct relation to Roxanne, that he doesn't feel worthy of her. Aside from that, he seems to be an incredibly confident character with no particular flaws, and who everyone largely seems to respect, other than, the people who are story-wise not supposed to. And nobody around him seems to particularly acknowledge his dwarfism as a problem, other than when the text says it should. And even then they kind of struggle to say why. They just say it is. They don't say why. So I think that Peter Dinklage puts on a very good performance, but in addition to that just being sort of a problem of a change in some direct ways, it also means that I don't think that he gets as much character development as a result. He is very much he's very much a character. He is less of the central character and more of a reactive character to the situations around him. I don't get the feeling that he is the main character that we are watching. It is much more of an ensemble production. And that could be down to wanting to have the stage play not overemphasize the Hollywood actor. Could be that. But it's neither here nor there. Ultimately, I think it sabotages the story and what is sort of a human interest piece of sorts about, or not a human interest piece, that's the wrong phrase, but you know what I mean. It is a character study of sorts. It is it's a very, I don't know what the right terminology for this is, because it's much more common in theater than it is in cinema. But to have a main character who is basically constantly on stage in every scene, it is key to every scene. And while he may play off of other characters, and those other characters may even, take center stage for substantial amounts of time, that the story still revolves it focuses on that character. It is their interpretation of the world, and they are the one whose story we ultimately want to see. This film, by comparison, like I said, is much more ensemble. We are watching these other characters have their own arcs in ways that seem to sort of undermine the, I don't want to say the moral, but the what I see as the core idea of the story, which is this tragedy of somebody who is not self-confident and who believes themselves to be have less value than they have. And so that leads to some other problems in the writing and the production. That said, I'm pretty happy with most of the other aspects of the production and of the other characters as well. I think all of the key performers are really great. I think some of the side characters, I particularly like the baker. The baker's great. I don't know who that actor is, but he was great. There are a bunch of minor characters who I think all put on great performances. There is a minor exception here, which is Roxanne's performer. I think it's Haley Bennett. At the beginning, left me a little jarred just because she seems to be wavering between doing an accent and not doing an accent. It settles within a few minutes, but it's just slightly weird, and I can't tell what she's trying to put on. And that gets to something else I want to talk about this reinterpretation, which is the setting. Now, Cyrano de Bergerac, written in the late 1800s, set in the 1600s. It's not clear in the film, but my impression is that this is probably set, it is still set in France, but it seems to be either like possibly Napoleonic Wars, possibly like 1700 sort of pre-revolutionary France or post-revolutionary France. it's a little unclear. The costuming is excellent all around, and I think the sets are really good as well. But the setting is different from the original. And I think that also leads to certain structural changes that have to be made, but may sacrifice things as a result. There are swords and there are guns, just as there are in the 1600s setting version. But visually it reads more like the 17 or 1800s. I don't know entirely what to take from that. It's not really good or bad. What is probably a good thing, and what made me bring it up, is because of the brief usage of an accent that Haley Bennett uses, is that for the most part, the characters are not putting on accents at all. And they're certainly not putting on French accents. There's some that are British, which is basically, a way to like dog whistle nobility in cinematic practice. But it doesn't seem like they didn't ask the actors to put on accents or to put on performances that were greatly changed from their own voice. And I think this is a positive. The actual text of the film is kind of interesting in that it wavers. I haven't read the original play, but the original play is written in rhyming verse. I don't remember the specifics of what it is, and they do break into that at certain points in the film. I don't know if those chunks are actually straight out of the text, and I don't know if the parts that are not in rhyming verse are heavily reinterpreted or completely new text, or if they were just adapted to fit the context, as closely as possible. And if I knew the story better, if I knew the play better, if I knew the original text better, I might be able to say something about that. But it does make me curious about the changes. And for somebody who is more well versed in this story, I'd be curious what those changes are like for somebody who has more experience. I think it's a little unfortunate that the film doesn't completely come together. And I can't figure out which direction I would have liked it to go. On the particular night that I watched it, I didn't really want to watch something that was quite this dramatic. It was not my intention. I was hoping for something a little bit more on the comedic drama side. And I don't think the changes would have to be that dramatic in order to execute that way. There is certainly enough comedy in this film, momentary comedy, that clearly the writing chops are there in order to do it that way. There's also part of me that wishes it wasn't a musical. Like I said, the music is a bit of a 50-50 split. And while the moments of the really strong musical moments make me want a better written musical, the bad musical moments make me want an interpretation that is not musical at all. Ultimately, whether or not this is a good film is hard to settle upon for me. I don't think I would watch it again. I would be hesitant to suggest it to somebody, and it would be definitely based on their tolerance for musicals, heavy drama, other sort of historical fiction things. Technically, I guess you could ask, do you like Les Mis? And if the answer is if the answer is no, then maybe don't recommend this. Otherwise, I think it's got some redeeming qualities that are really strong. And like I said, it certainly worked on me. It got to me. But it's not the Cyrano de Bergerac story I want, I guess. Either because of the tone or because of the musicality or some combination of both, it doesn't come together for me. But that said, I think it's a good production. And I would not try and tell anybody off from watching it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.